the toxicology report. We don't know if this guy was on something, that they hit him with the pepper spray and it just didn't really affect him. And we don't have an autopsy from the city, an official autopsy. Immediately, I didn't see any death blows. Maybe it was an accumulation of blunt force trauma to the head.
On Friday, the nation waited for the horrific video of Tyre Nichols to be released. The brutal video showed a group of police officers beating the unarmed Nichols to death. Right-wing pundits, however, wasted absolutely no time this weekend on their attacks of Nichols, as well as the protesters who were demanding justice and systemic change. And of course, they also downplayed the murder of Tyre Nichols. Now, we're not gonna make you watch the video of the fatal beating footage of Tyre Nichols, but we do have some information for you that discusses what happened in the videos. So the Daily Beast reported the footage shows the cops pull Nichols over for a traffic stop before aggressively tossing him on the pavement as they shout threats and draw their guns. More footage shows cops repeatedly punching him in the head before pepper spraying him as he desperately called out for his mother. And I also just want to point out something that happened in the video. You can see the police officers passing Nichols' beaten body around so that each officer gets an opportunity to land blows on this man who's barely conscious at this point. It's truly, truly disturbing. But Waters, however, suggested that perhaps the police were not to blame for Nichols' death at all. In fact, Waters also said he was waiting to see the toxicology report on Nichols, as if anything in that report would justify the cops murdering him. And then, of course, there's also Brian Kilmeade, who wants to hear the police's side of the situation.
Does it bother you we don't have the cops' perspective at all? I mean, it looks overwhelming. I get it. But don't we need both sides?
Well,
these were evidently elite cops. These weren't just fresh out of the academy.
No, but they had a reputation for being extremely aggressive.
We're going to get their body cam video. We'll know what they said, and then they will also have their day in court.
And the release of the footage sparked protests around the country, as I mentioned earlier. And of course, Tucker Carlson just had to chime in on that.
It's the very same people who are weeping on television about police brutality applauded when one of Nancy Pelosi's officers murdered an unarmed woman called Ashley Babbitt. Yes, murdered. That's exactly what that was. Far more clearly than anything you just saw in the videotape we played.
Naturally, Tucker Carlson has to conflate this with what happened to Ashley Babbitt. But we also have this graph I want to show you all that shows where in the country these protests were occurring or are still ongoing, as obviously the protesters' calls for justice have not been fully answered yet. But unfortunately, the right-wing nonsense didn't stop there. We got another clip of what Tucker Carlson's guest had to say.
It was a group of young black men, 5-on-1. Looked like gang violence to me. It looked like what young black men do when they're supervised by a single black woman. And that's what they got going on in the Memphis Police Department. They've elected some or put some black woman in charge of the police force. And we're getting the same kind of chaos and disunity and violence that we see in a lot of these cities that are run by single mothers.
Somehow, single mothers are to blame for Tyre Nichols' death. I mean, you can't make this stuff up coming out of Fox News. Now, I have more information on what the murderous cops have been charged with, but before we get to that, Jessica, I want to bring you in here on this. They say the devil works hard, but Fox News works harder. What do you make of all this?
Yeah, it turns out you can fight racism with racism, Fox News seems to believe. Ridiculous Jesse Waters is like, oh, well, we haven't got the autopsy for this situation. It could have been Colonel Mustard in the study with a candlestick. Could be anything. Be so for real. Then to say a toxicology report is needed because conveniently Tyre would have OD'd the moment cops were beating him. The fact that the autopsy could say a number of things. It could say asphyxiation. It could say blunt force trauma to the head, like he named. It could have been cardiac arrest, considering he was tased. And he was tased by a white officer, which they failed to mention. They say that this was 5 young black men beating on another man who is black. I'm sorry, if this was just this narrative of black on black violence, Wouldn't the cops be hurting each other? No, it was everyone in uniform beating on someone who is not in uniform, who is a young black man. I mean, to ignore the root problem of white supremacy is exactly what they wanted to do. And it seems as though they just picked from the hat of prejudice. Like, what are we gonna talk about today? Oh, it looks like single mothers. We're gonna somehow make this about single mothers. I really don't think it's much deeper than that when they decide, how are we gonna make this about anything other than precisely what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing I've seen coming from a lot of these right-wing pundits is this idea that, left-wing activists and people demanding racial justice in this country are going to be silent on this because it wasn't a white officer, despite the fact that you mentioned there was a white officer involved. But I think the fact that, the graph I showed you about the, sparking of all these protests around the country sort of negates that argument, but they're still going to run with it because they would never let facts get in the way of their ridiculous grift. Now, Jessica, you also mentioned the 5 officers who were charged who were black. So we have this picture of those officers who have been charged. So the first is Tadarius Bean, and we have Demetrius Haley, Emmett Martin III, Desmond Mills Jr., and Justin Smith. So I also have some more information on those arrests and what these murderers have been charged with. So from CNN, Martin III, Smith, Bean, Haley, and Mills Jr. have each been charged with second-degree murder, aggravated assault, 2 charges of aggravated kidnapping, 2 charges of official misconduct, and 1 charge of official oppression. So there's also an update Jessica mentioned earlier. There was a 6th officer who is white, and he has been relieved of duty. From Memphis News, we get this headline: 6th Memphis police officer involved in Tyre Nichols' death relieved of duty. Memphis police officer Preston Hemphill, who was hired in 2018, was relieved of duty when MPD started their investigation into Nichols' death. We also have a picture of that officer here. So that is Hemphill, who I will just note has not been charged, not yet. He was relieved of duty, but has not yet been charged despite being there and participating in the actions that led to Tyre Nichols' death. So Jessica, what does this mean for the people who are demanding justice, the protesters in the streets who are, fighting for some systemic change? These protests have been ongoing. We think back to the George Floyd protests, but I mean, it's centuries of protesting to demand racial justice, to demand, an end to police brutality. What is the outlook for those protests, in your opinion?
I think most people are now coming to terms with the fact that this is not an institution that can be reformed. This is not something where any amount of training or any policy changes will reform this. And more people are talking about abolition than before. And a lot of people think that means, okay, there's gonna be no method of public safety. And really what this is about is most people don't feel safe right now. Many people will face a type of situation where traditionally you would say call the police, and people don't, because they know that the situation would likely escalate if they did. So if we don't feel safe, using this institution, the police, which is supposed to be an institution that protects and serves the public, which it doesn't, and it never has. So I think more people are talking about what are alternatives to the police that will actually bring about public safety, which we don't have right now. It's not reimagining public safety, it's establishing it. And I think the more we center the conversation around that, rather than reforms, giving more money to the police and more training to the police, I think that's really end game now for everyone that's in the streets.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right. There are a lot more people looking to abolition as, a solution to this. And they're, moving away from calling the police in these instances. And there's a lot of misinformation or bad information out there about abolition. Someone I would suggest looking to who I think condenses what the abolitionist movement is in really understandable terms is Olayemi Olurin. Check her out on Twitter. She has a Substack. She writes articles about it. She's a public defender. Just a great individual. So we'll keep you updated on developments in this case, especially if this 6th white officer is charged